Um, the hallucinogenic drugs mostly produce, in fact, I would always say they always produce visual hallucinations. I think auditory and musical hallucinations are pretty rare. Um, and the visual hallucinations will sometimes start off as geometric patterns and colors, and then one would see landscapes and sometimes enormous crystals or fields of flowers, um, and I think they're a little bit like opium dreams, although in other ways, sort of, I think these drug hallucinations are not like dreams. You're not asleep. They're there next to consciousness. I've a lot of my awakenings patients, when they took L-Dopa for their Parkinson's, would have hallucinations. Something I found very remarkable and not easy to imagine, because I was brought up in a sort of fairly musical world, and music is an essential part of my world, was to meet someone, a delightful, intelligent lady who lives in New York, who cannot perceive music as such, cannot recognize music. This was apparent when she was a little girl, when she couldn't recognize any music, and when she was asked to sing, she really didn't know what was meant. And people were puzzled because she wasn't deaf. She could speak perfectly well and hear their speech and hear ambient noises, but she seemed to have no idea of what music was about. And when she was tested at one point, she really couldn't say whether one note was higher or lower than another note. And she tried to get interested in music. She would go along with boyfriends and her husband to concerts, and she found the experience somewhere between unintelligible and excruciating. And but it was a great relief to her. People often suffer from the feeling that they're unique. And she saw an article some years ago saying that, yes, there's a thing called congenital amusia, and some researchers in Canada were working on this. And she got in touch with the people in Canada, and they came and visited her, and they tested her, and they were very reassuring. They told her, first, she's not the only person in the world like this, there are some others, and they'd be happy to introduce her to some fellow amusics. They said, second, this was not just bad motivation or neurosis, as her family had said. This was a real neurological condition, and a little part of her brain was not that well developed. And they also said to her, you don't have to go to concerts anymore. If your husband wants you to go to a concert, you say, you go, I'll go to a film or something. But this lady, can't hear tones or semitones. She can't hear the intervals which compose a scale. She has no idea about music. And so I spent a lot of time with her. She has a good ear for poetry and for language, but no ear for music. And so I for some reason, that sticks in my mind as very, very fascinating. I think in general, what has especially startled me is to have people talk about musical hallucinations. And a hallucination is not at all like a mental image. It's very startling. People look around, they listen, I first heard of this in the 1970s. It was an old lady in a nursing home, and she described to me how she'd been woken one night by hearing songs, Irish songs, sung very, very loudly. And her immediate thought was, of course, someone had the radio on loudly, and she was amazed, in fact outraged, that someone would have a radio on that loud in the middle of the night when everyone was asleep, although she was rather surprised to find that people were still asleep. And she went looking for the radio, and she couldn't find it. And then she She'd heard that a filling in a tooth could sometimes pick up radio waves. And then she thought about it more, and these were only songs that she knew, and they kept being repeated again and again, and sometimes just fragments of songs, and there was no commentary. And then she started to realize that as she put it, the radio was in her head and that she was hallucinating. And when people hallucinate, it's very bewildering and rather terrifying. But and what she was describing in her hallucinations were really very early memories and early musical memories, which were now being somehow regurgitated in her mind. And I've in fact spoken now to hundreds of people with musical hallucinations, and each time it startles me as it startles them. Most of us have never had a hallucination. You have to have had a hallucination to know how startling it is and how you mistake it for an external perception, how you will look around for the source of it, and then you have to realize that some part of your brain and your mind is on automatic and is producing these perceptions. And in general, I think sort of speaking with people with musical hallucinations, which can sometimes be very beautiful and very moving, sometimes rather frightening. One of my patients, for example, started to hallucinate Nazi marching songs, which he had heard as a boy growing up in Germany in the 1930s. As a Jewish boy, he was terrified of the Hitler Jugend and their songs, and fortunately for him, the Nazi marching songs were then replaced by some Tchaikovsky. But it's really, I've been amazed continually by these people, because it shows in a way that everything one has heard, even if one didn't consciously listen to it, is recorded pretty indelibly in the brain, and it can be reproduced. And so it shows something very remarkable about the brain, and also about people's ability to learn to live with hallucinations. The world has changed so much in the last 10 years. This is very beautifully brought out in our Philip Roth novel called Exit Ghost, where Roth's alter ego, who has been living in the country, comes back into New York City in 2004, and he finds that everyone is on iPods, is on cell phones, and that society as he knew it, and human interaction, has more or less disappeared. That everyone is engrossed, in these things which are almost analogous to hallucinations. They're hearing music, they're hearing voices, they're talking. Two things about iPods, or three things. Listen, first, I have an iPod myself. I have all Bach on my iPod. I have the equivalent of 157 CDs on my iPod. And as a Bach lover, it's a fantastic privilege to have all Bach in something the size of a matchbox. However, I don't listen to it in the street. I don't listen to it when I'm driving the car. I don't listen to it when I ride my bicycle, because I need my attention for reality. I'm frightened at the degree of engrossment which people can have with iPods, and I think they should almost be forbidden to cyclists and pedestrians. I also wonder whether to separate music from context. Music arose in a communal way. People would sing together, dance together. There would be concerts, there would be churches, there would be living performers, and I think music can become too abstract and too divorced from context if one only listens to an iPod. It's wonderful that iPods can give so much, but I'm also concerned that they may take people away from musical environments and contexts in which they should have music. So I'm a little worried about the isolating and abstracting and also dangerously engrossing qualities of iPods. Well, first I would say that the human brain and the human mind is disposed to create stories or narratives. Children love stories, make up stories. Jerome Bruner, a great psychologist, has spoken of two modes of thinking. One is to create narratives, and one is to create paradigms or explanations or models. And of course some of these will come together because then you want to have a story which explains. We all come into the world, and human beings sort of evolved into a mysterious world and had to wonder where they came from, how the world came from, what are the stars doing, and in the absence of better explanations, I think sort of supernatural explanations sort of come to mind. There must have been some great figure who created the universe and who perhaps is keeping an eye on us now. And say before 1859, before Darwin, before The Origin of Species was published, there was no natural explanation of how different animals and plants had come into being, let alone human beings. I think of Freeman Dyson, a great physicist, who once wrote, he said, "I am a practicing Christian, but not a believing one." So I think my parents were practicing Jews, but not believing ones. I don't think that belief is a particularly strong thing in Judaism. But my mother was also botanically inclined, and I sort of, I as it were, grew up in a Darwinian world, and I was very startled when I came to the States, and found that millions and millions of people didn't believe in evolution. I still am profoundly perplexed. And to proclaim that one doesn't believe in evolution, I think would label one as an idiot in most of the civilized world. So certainly in Europe. Again, growing up in Europe, it was my feeling that it was our feeling the world would become more and more secular. And now, of course, it's a world stamped by mad, dangerous fundamentalism on all sides. And who would have thought that the 21st century would dissolve into religious conflict? I mean, for myself, I'm a sort of quiet, old Jewish atheist. I'm not a militant atheist. I don't sort of argue about things like Dawkins and Dennett and Sam Harris. I quite like their books, but I'm not militant by nature, and I'm not very argumentative by nature. And if people want to believe, well, then that's their business. I mean, what concerns me is when belief is used to influence and corrupt education or politics. And it seems to me monstrous that creationism or so-called intelligent design is taught next to evolution or instead of it. And I do think of it as almost as a form of madness. I think I need to say that there are specifically some conditions of the brain which predispose to mystical or religious thinking. And in particular, when people have so-called temporal lobe epilepsy or temporal lobe seizures, they may have religious or mystical visions, or even between seizures, they may have a gradual personality change which disposes them to mystical and religious thinking. And so I think that thinking of this sort is, if you want, built into the nervous system, although it doesn't have to take an explicitly sort of theistic notion. I mean, Einstein always used to say that the most beautiful thing in the world is the mysterious. And I think that the fundamental sense of mystery and awe and of the sublime is behind all science and art. I mean, basically, I think science springs from a sense of nature's mysteriousness and the wonder of nature, and there is no need to invoke anything supernatural. Indeed, I think too much involvement in the supernatural may blind one to the wonder of nature, and I'm slightly terrified by certain fundamentalists who say, let the planet go to hell, sort of, the final coming is going to be soon. God will take care of it all. I mean, I live for myself happily and completely within nature. I love it. I have a sense of being at home. I don't pine for anything else. And so I think those parts of my temporal lobes are devoted to, as it were, to an almost religious feeling for nature. From what I read, I think that all sorts of changes, at least temporary changes, may be possible. One can certainly get states of calm and alter the brain rhythms and have states of trance. Whether they're permanent changes, I don't know. But any learning experience changes the brain, and nothing more, incidentally, than musical learning. So that the brains of musicians are visibly different and even grossly different from the brains of other people. Yeah, very, very strongly. Most of my own work is with elderly people with neurological problems of one sort or another, and I can see how their lives can be transformed by music and sometimes by poetry and art. But say people with Parkinson's may be unable to move or speak unless there's music. People who have Alzheimer's and are confused and lost and agitated or disoriented can be focused wonderfully sometimes by familiar music, which will give them a link to the past and to their own memories, which they can't access in any other way. Sometimes people who are aphasic and have lost the power of language can get it back through music. Now, I don't have direct experience with young people, but from everything I read, I think that music and other forms of art need to be an essential part of education. I mean, this is an essential part of being human. And although I wouldn't sort of locate everything in the right hemisphere, we are not sort of calculating machines. We need the arts as much as we need everything else. Well, this so-called Mozart effect was described actually in a very modest way about 15 years ago, and it then got taken up by the media and hyped and exaggerated in a way which was rather embarrassing to the original describers. I think there's very little to suggest that a little Mozart as background will make any difference. On the other hand, real engagement with music, and especially performing music or listening attentively, can make a great deal of difference. And especially early in life, you see this in people, say, who do Suzuki training. And a year of Suzuki training can not only enhance one's musicality and alter the brain quite visibly, but the effect seems to leak over to some extent into forms of visual thinking and logical thinking, pattern recognition, and so forth. So a little musical background is not enough, but real musical engagement, I think, can be very important. One needs to distinguish, Freud made a point, say, of distinguishing neurotic misery and depression from what he called common unhappiness. The common unhappiness is what we all feel when we're grieved, when we lose people, when things go wrong. Prozac has been and can be a lifesaver for people who are pathologically depressed. Depression is the main cause of suicide. And antidepressants of all sorts have been very crucial. There are many different sorts, and sort of Prozac belongs to a particular sort. But there's all the difference in the world having a medication for a pathological state and something which you want to enhance sort of normal living. I mean, this becomes a huge issue, whether it's steroids with athletes or whatever. If Prozac can produce a sort of bland, nonchalant state, the question is whether such a state is a good one or whether it's morally responsible. I think one needs to have all one's emotional sympathies and sensitivities and vulnerabilities out there. It sometimes seems as if childhood itself it becomes a diagnosis, becomes a disease. Hundreds of thousands of children, I think, are probably improperly diagnosed as hyperactive or as having attention disorder of one sort or another, and are put on the amphetamines or Ritalin. And I think there do exist genuine forms of attention hyperactivity disorder which may need medication, but I think these are pretty rare, and I suspect that 9 out of 10 kids who are diagnosed as having this do not have any such syndrome, but are reacting to situations at school, or it's a normal stage of development. Kids are impulsive. This is the nature of youth. It's one of the wonders of youth. It's one of the things one needs to keep all through life. I think there are real dangers of over-medicating children and of us all over-medicating ourselves. And it may not stop with over-medicating, because sooner or later we're going to be able to have our genes altered or to have computer chips put in our brain, and the whole business of quote unquote an enhanced existence as opposed to a natural one is going to come up. I think I'd been interested in writing since, I don't know, I was 12 or whatever. I've always kept journals, certainly steadily for the last 60 years. I didn't know how the writing and science and medicine could come together, or if they would ever come together, but they did seem to come together in the stories of patients and case histories. And I had in fact written my first book on migraine before I encountered these patients at Beth Abraham. I would recommend keeping a journal, period. I hadn't thought of it particularly as a happiness-producing device. I mean, I think for myself, there's always been a need to make some sort of narrative sense and to describe people and events and situations and feelings, and I need to keep a journal, partly as an act of clarification, and partly also because it allows my imagination and fantasy free rein, but somehow held within a sort of framework. But I hugely enjoy the act of writing, and I find it absolutely necessary. Whether it's keeping a journal or any other sort of writing, I'm certainly unhappy when I can't write. So for me, writing is a central form of happiness. not specifically keeping a journal, but for someone else it may be sort of, I mean, I think anything, something creative is needed. How it works. I would like to know how the 100 billion neurons in their incessant interactions are able to create this wonderful thing we call thought, feeling, language, humanity, individuality, consciousness. I mean, this is the ultimate brain-mind question. It's the ultimate question which neurologists sort of, you know, whether it could be answered even in principle, I don't know, but sort of I think we're getting closer in some ways, and I hope I live long enough to get some feeling of the answer there.